Sweetheart, economy's in the back. You're clearly in the wrong place. That's what the pilot told 16-year-old Serafina Williams as she settled into her business class seat, clutching her birthday boarding pass. He didn't care to scan her ticket. He didn't care that she belonged there. All he saw was a young black girl, alone, sitting where he didn't think she should be. But what he didn't see, what none of them saw, was who she was about to call. And when that call connected, this wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about power, legacy, and one man's career about to go down in flames. The scent of new leather and subtle, expensive perfume filled Serafina Williams's senses as she sank into the plush embrace of seat 4B. For her 16th birthday, her father, the formidable Robert Williams, CEO of a global logistics empire, had gifted her a round-trip, business-class ticket to Paris. It was more than just a luxurious flight. It was a rite of passage, a solo trip to explore the art and culture she adored, a brief, shimmering escape from the gilded cage of her life in New York City. Saria was a study in understated elegance, dressed in a simple but well-tailored black turtleneck and dark jeans, with her hair braided in intricate cornrows that cascaded down her back. She clutched a worn copy of The Picture of Dorian Gray. She was an old soul, more at home in the quiet halls of the Met than at the boisterous parties her peers frequented. Her heart, at that moment, was a fluttering bird, a mix of nervous excitement and the quiet thrill of independence. She had just finished arranging her small backpack in the overhead compartment when a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a man in a crisp pilot's uniform, his silver-winged pin glinting under the cabin's soft lighting. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that might have been handsome, were it not for the deep-set scowl that seemed etched into his features. His name tag read Captain Harrison. "Can I help you?" Saria asked, her voice polite, though a prickle of unease ran down her spine. Captain Harrison's eyes, a startlingly pale blue, swept over her, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on her face, her hair, her attire. It was a look she knew all too well, a silent, dismissive appraisal that questioned her presence in a space he clearly felt she didn't belong. "This isn't your seat, little girl," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried an unmistakable edge of authority. He didn't wait for her response, instead jerking a thumb towards the back of the aircraft. "Economy is that way." Saria's initial surprise quickly morphed into a familiar, weary indignation. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat. 4B. She held up her boarding pass, the bold black letters clearly indicating her name and seat assignment. The captain barely glanced at it. "There must be some mistake," he said, his tone unwavering. He gestured to a flight attendant, a young woman with a nervous smile, whose name tag identified her as Chloe. "Chloe, could you please assist this young lady in finding her correct seat in the economy cabin?" Chloe's eyes darted between the formidable captain and the composed teenager. She gave Saria an apologetic look. "Of course, Captain. Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass?" Saria, her hand trembling slightly, showed Chloe the pass. The flight attendant's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "Captain," she began, her voice hesitant, "the boarding pass is for seat 4B. Captain Harrison's scowl deepened. He snatched the boarding pass from Saria's hand, his fingers brushing against hers with a dismissive touch. He scrutinized it, turning it over as if expecting to find some hidden flaw. A 16-year-old in business class, flying alone? Highly unlikely. The comment, laced with condescending disbelief, sent a hot flush of anger through Saria. "I am 16, she said, her voice firmer now. "And I am flying alone. It was a birthday present." The captain let out a short, humorless laugh. "A birthday present? Right. Look, I've been flying for 25 years. I know a freeloader when I see one. You probably snuck past the gate agent." His accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. A few of the other business-class passengers ensconced in their private pods began to stir, their curiosity piqued by the escalating drama. A man in a tailored suit across the aisle, who had been engrossed in his tablet, now watched with open interest. A woman with a perfectly coiffed blonde bob and a string of pearls whispered to her companion. "I did not sneak past anyone," Saria said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "My ticket was purchased for me. If you'd like to scan it again, you'll see that it's valid." "I'm not going to waste my time," the captain retorted, his voice growing louder, more belligerent. "I have a flight to prepare for. Now, are you going to move, or am I going to have you removed?" The threat was stark, brutal. Saria's heart pounded against her ribs. She was acutely aware of the eyes on her, the silent judgments being passed. She felt a familiar sting behind her eyes, the threat of tears, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. "I am not moving from the seat that was paid for," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You have no right to treat me this way." "I have every right," Captain Harrison boomed, his face reddening with anger. "I am the captain of this aircraft. My word is law here, and I say you are not sitting in business class." He turned to Chloe again, his voice sharp with command. "Chloe, call security. Have this girl escorted off my plane." Chloe looked horrified. "Captain, perhaps we could just verify the ticket with the gate agent? It would only take a moment." "Are you questioning my authority?" he snarled, his pale blue eyes flashing with fury. Chloe shrank back, her face pale. "No, Captain, of course not." Saria felt a surge of despair. She was trapped, her dream trip turning into a nightmare before the plane had even left the tarmac. The injustice of it all, the blatant prejudice was suffocating. She knew what this was about. It wasn't about a ticket. It was about the color of her skin, her age, the assumptions he had made the moment he laid eyes on her. As the captain turned his back on her, seemingly confident in his victory, Saria's mind raced. Her father's words echoed in her ears. "Never let anyone make you feel small, Saria. Your voice matters." With a deep breath, she reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone. Her fingers, still trembling, flew across the screen. There was one person who could cut through this pilot's tyrannical reign. One person whose authority he couldn't question. She found the number she knew by heart and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Then a familiar, calm voice answered. "Saria, is everything all right, sweetheart?" "Dad," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I have a problem." She glanced up at Captain Harrison, who was now imperiously directing another flight attendant to begin pre-flight checks. He was oblivious for now to the storm she was about to unleash, a storm that would not only cost him his flight, but would send shockwaves through the entire airline industry. The gilded cage had been rattled, and the world was about to see the fury of a girl who had been pushed too far, and behind her the quiet power of a father who would move heaven and earth for his daughter. The plug was about to be pulled, and the free fall would be spectacular. "Dad," Saria repeated, her voice a fragile thread in the hushed, tense atmosphere of the business class cabin. "I'm on the plane at JFK, but there's a problem." On the other end of the line, in a sprawling corner office overlooking the twinkling expanse of Manhattan, Robert Williams leaned forward in his leather chair, his brow furrowing with concern. He was in the middle of a high-stakes conference call, finalizing a multi-billion-dollar merger, but his daughter's voice, laced with a distress she rarely showed, instantly commanded his full attention. He muted the conference call without a second thought. "What kind of problem, sweetheart? Are you hurt?" His voice was a low, soothing baritone, a stark contrast to the aggressive tones that had just filled the cabin. "No, I'm not hurt," Saria said, her gaze fixed on Captain Harrison's back. "It's the pilot. He won't let me sit in my seat. He says I don't belong in business class." Robert's grip on his phone tightened, his knuckles turning white. A cold, dangerous anger began to simmer beneath his calm exterior. He had spent his entire life building a world where his daughter would be judged by the content of her character, not the color of her skin or any preconceived notions about her age or background. To hear that she was facing such blatant discrimination, on a trip that was meant to be a celebration of her independence, was more than he could bear. He said, "What?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. "He called me a freeloader," Saria whispered, the humiliation of the word stinging her anew. "He said I probably snuck on. He's threatening to have security remove me from the plane." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, charged with a palpable fury. Saria could picture her father's face, the way his jaw would clench, the thunder that would gather in his dark eyes. "Put him on the phone, Saria," Robert said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, replaced by a steely resolve. Saria took a shaky breath. "He won't talk to me, Dad. He's ignoring me." "Then make him listen," Robert instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Tell him that Robert Williams wants to have a word with him." The name, spoken with such quiet authority, seemed to hang in the air between them. It was a name that carried immense weight in the world of business and finance, a name that opened doors and commanded respect. Saria stood up, her small frame radiating a newfound strength. She walked towards the front of the cabin, her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. Captain Harrison was now deep in conversation with the co-pilot, their heads bent over a flight plan. "Excuse me, Captain Harrison," Saria said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through their conversation. He turned, an annoyed expression on his face. "I thought I told you to—" "My father would like to speak with you," she interrupted, holding out her phone. "His name is Robert Williams." The captain stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. He let out a condescending snort. "And I'm supposed to be impressed. I don't care who your father is. I've already told you." "I suggest you take the call, Captain," Saria said, her eyes locking with his, her gaze unwavering. There was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet confidence that seemed to momentarily throw him off balance. He hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his pale blue eyes. The name Robert Williams seemed to echo in the cavernous space of his memory, a faint, distant bell of recognition. But his arrogance, his ingrained sense of superiority, quickly reasserted itself. "I'm not talking to anyone's father," he sneered, turning his back on her once more. "Now for the last time, go to the back of the plane or you're getting off." Saria pulled the phone back to her ear. "He won't take the call, Dad." "All right, Saria," Robert said, his voice now laced with a chilling calm. "Tell me the airline and the flight number." "It's Orifly, flight 714 to Paris," she replied, her heart beginning to race again, but this time with a different emotion, a sense of impending righteous justice. "Orifly," Robert repeated, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He unmuted his conference call. "Gentlemen, something has come to my attention that requires my immediate focus. We'll have to postpone this discussion." He ended the call without waiting for a response, his mind already working with a terrifying efficiency. He swiveled in his chair and pressed a button on his intercom. "Jessica," he said to his executive assistant, "get me Richard Davenport on his private line. Now." Richard Davenport was the CEO of Orifly, a man Robert had known for years, both personally and professionally. Their relationship was one of mutual respect, built on a foundation of lucrative business deals. Robert's company, Williams Global Logistics, was one of Orifly's largest and most important corporate clients. As Jessica worked to connect him, Robert's eyes fell on a framed photo on his desk. It was of a younger Saria, her face bright with an innocent gap-toothed smile, her arms wrapped around his neck. A wave of protective fury washed over him, so intense it almost took his breath away. "Richard is on the line, Mr. Williams," Jessica's voice crackled through the intercom. Robert picked up the receiver. "Richard," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "Robert Williams, I'm afraid we have a serious problem." Meanwhile, back on the plane, Captain Harrison was growing increasingly agitated by Saria's refusal to budge. He saw her as a direct challenge to his authority, a disruption to the well-oiled machine of his flight. "Right, that's it," he snarled, his face a mask of fury. "I'm calling airport security myself." He reached for the cockpit phone, but just as his fingers brushed against the receiver, a frantic voice crackled over the cabin's PA system. It was the gate agent. "Captain Harrison, please report to the gate immediately. Captain Harrison, to the gate immediately." The captain froze, his hand hovering over the phone. The urgency in the gate agent's voice was unmistakable. He shot Saria a venomous glare, as if this new development was somehow her fault. "Stay right there," he growled at her, though the threat now seemed to lack its earlier conviction. He straightened his uniform and strode down the aisle, his face a thundercloud of confusion and annoyance. The other passengers watched his departure with a mixture of relief and anticipation. The man in the suit across the aisle leaned forward and gave Saria a small, encouraging smile. Saria remained standing, her phone still pressed to her ear. "Dad, what's happening?" "Just stay on the line, sweetheart," Robert said, his voice a steady, reassuring presence in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "Everything is being taken care of." She could hear a muffled, agitated voice in the background of her father's call, Richard Davenport, the CEO of Orifly, his voice a frantic torrent of apologies and promises. The minutes stretched on, thick with an almost unbearable tension. Then the cabin door opened again, and a flustered-looking woman in an Orifly supervisor's uniform hurried onto the plane, followed by a pale and shaken Captain Harrison. The supervisor's eyes scanned the cabin and landed on Saria. She rushed over, her face a mask of professional contrition. "Miss Williams," she said, her voice breathy and anxious, "I am so sorry for this misunderstanding. Please take your seat. Can I get you anything? A drink? A blanket?" Saria was speechless. The whiplash of the situation, the sudden groveling apology, was dizzying. She looked past the supervisor to Captain Harrison. He stood there, his face ashen, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the floor, his hands clenched at his sides. "There's been a change of plans, Miss Williams," the supervisor continued, her voice trembling slightly. This flight has been canceled." A collective gasp went through the cabin. "Canceled?" The passengers began to murmur, their voices rising in a chorus of confusion and frustration. "Canceled?" Saria echoed, her mind struggling to process the information. "Yes," the supervisor said, wringing her hands, "due to unforeseen operational issues." But Saria knew the truth. She looked at the disgraced pilot, at the panicked supervisor, and she knew. This wasn't an operational issue. This was the consequence of a single phone call. Her father hadn't just pulled her out of a difficult situation. He had pulled the plug on the entire flight. The calm had been broken, and the storm had only just begun. The announcement of the flight's cancellation sent a ripple of disbelief and then a wave of angry protest through the business class cabin. Voices rose in a cacophony of indignation. "Canceled? What do you mean canceled?" A man in a rumpled linen suit demanded, his face reddening with frustration. "I have a connecting flight in Paris. I have a meeting in the morning." "This is outrageous," exclaimed the woman with the pearl necklace, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. "I demand an explanation." The supervisor, a woman named Maria, looked overwhelmed. Her carefully practiced customer service smile stretched to its breaking point. She held up her hands, attempting to placate the increasingly irate passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please. I understand your frustration. We are working to rebook everyone on the next available flights. Please disembark the aircraft in an orderly fashion, and our ground staff will assist you." Her words did little to quell the rising tide of anger, but amidst the chaos, Saria stood in a small, surreal bubble of silence. She watched as the passengers who just moments before had been silent observers of her humiliation now directed their fury at the airline. She looked at Captain Harrison. He was no longer the imposing, authoritative figure who had tried to belittle her. He was a man utterly broken, his face a pale, slack mask of shock. He seemed to have aged a decade in the last 10 minutes. His pale blue eyes, which had once held such arrogance, were now wide with a dawning horror. He knew. In that moment, Saria was certain of it. He knew that this unforeseen operational issue was a direct consequence of his actions. He had picked a fight with the wrong 16-year-old. as the passengers began to reluctantly gather their belongings, grumbling and casting resentful glances in Saria's direction, as if she were somehow the cause of their inconvenience. Maria, the supervisor, approached her again. "Miss Williams," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Mr. Davenport, our CEO, is on his way to the airport personally. He would like to offer his sincerest apologies in person." Saria was taken aback. The CEO of the airline was coming to the airport to apologize to her. The scale of the fallout was far greater than she could have imagined. "And Captain Harrison," Maria continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "he has been grounded, indefinitely, pending a full investigation." The word grounded hung in the air between them, imbued with a finality that sent a chill down Saria's spine. For a pilot, being grounded was the ultimate punishment, a stripping away of their identity, their livelihood. Saria's gaze drifted back to the captain. He was being spoken to by another airline official, his posture slumped in defeat. He looked up and his eyes met Saria's. There was no anger in them now, no arrogance. Only a raw, desperate plea for, what? Forgiveness? Understanding. It was too late for that. With a heavy heart, Saria gathered her backpack and her book. As she walked down the aisle, the other passengers fell silent, their eyes following her every move. She could feel their resentment, their whispered accusations. But she held her head high, her father's words echoing in her mind. When she stepped out of the jet bridge and into the bustling terminal, a man in a sharp, dark suit immediately approached her. "Miss Williams, I'm from Mr. Davenport's office. Please come with me." He led her away from the disgruntled crowd of her former fellow passengers and towards a private lounge. The lounge was an oasis of calm, with plush armchairs and a panoramic view of the runway. A few minutes later, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a deeply worried expression hurried in. "Miss Williams," he said, extending his hand, "I am Richard Davenport, and I cannot begin to tell you how profoundly sorry I am for what you experienced on our aircraft today." His apology was effusive, almost desperate. He spoke of his shock, his disgust, his shame that such an incident could have happened on his airline. He promised a full and transparent investigation, a complete overhaul of their customer service training, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Saria listened politely, her emotions a tangled mess of vindication, pity, and a growing sense of unease. This was more than just an apology. This was damage control on a massive scale. "Your father, Robert Williams," Davenport said, his voice laced with a nervous respect, "is one of our most valued partners. The contract we have with Williams Global Logistics is significant." And there it was. The other shoe had dropped. This wasn't just about a wronged teenager. This was about a multi-million-dollar corporate account that was now hanging in the balance. Her father hadn't just pulled the plug on a single flight. He had threatened to pull the plug on his entire business relationship with Aura Fly. The thought sent a fresh wave of shock through Saria. She had known her father was powerful, but she had never truly understood the extent of that power, the way it could bend the world to his will. Davenport, mistaking her silence for dissatisfaction, rushed on. "We have arranged a private jet to take you to Paris, Miss Williams. It's waiting for you on the tarmac. You will have the entire plane to yourself, and we would like to offer you a lifetime supply of first-class tickets on any Aurafly flight to any destination in the world. A private jet, a lifetime of free flights." The offers were staggering, almost comical in their extravagance, but they felt hollow, a desperate attempt to buy her silence, to smooth over an ugly incident with the gloss of luxury. "Thank you, Mr. Davenport," Saria said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I don't want a private jet. I don't want a lifetime of free tickets." Davenport looked taken aback. "You don't?" "No," Saria said. "I just wanted to go to Paris, on the ticket my father bought for me, and I wanted to be treated with respect." Her simple, honest words seemed to hang in the air, a stark contrast to the corporate maneuvering and frantic damage control that was swirling around her. Davenport looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not the daughter of a powerful CEO, not a potential lawsuit, but a young woman who had been deeply hurt, whose dream trip had been shattered by the ugliness of prejudice. A look of genuine shame crossed his face. "You're right, Miss Williams," he said, his voice subdued. "You're absolutely right, and we failed you. I failed you." He paused, then said, "The offer for the private jet still stands. It's the least we can do. Please allow us to get you to Paris safely and comfortably." Saria hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to reject their lavish attempts to make amends. But another part of her was just a tired, disappointed 16-year-old who wanted to salvage what was left of her birthday present. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." As she was escorted to the private jet, a sleek, gleaming marvel of aviation technology, she couldn't shake the image of Captain Harrison's broken face. She had won. The bully had been punished. But the victory felt strangely empty. The grounding of Captain Harrison was just the beginning. The real karma, the hard, life-altering karma, was yet to come. And it would not be confined to the sterile corridors of an airport. It would follow him home, into the heart of his life, and dismantle it, piece by painful piece. The story was far from over. The news of Orifly Flight 714's abrupt cancellation, and the subsequent grounding of its captain, spread through the aviation community like wildfire. At first it was just whispers, fragments of gossip exchanged between flight crews and ground staff. But in the age of social media, whispers quickly become shouts. The man in the tailored suit who had witnessed the initial confrontation, a tech entrepreneur named Ben Carter, had discreetly filmed the entire exchange on his phone. Once he was off the plane and rebooked on another flight, he uploaded the video to Twitter, along with a scathing account of what he had witnessed. "Disgusted by the blatant racism I just witnessed on at Orifly Flight 714, he wrote. "A young black girl was harassed and threatened by the pilot, Captain Harrison, for simply trying to sit in her paid-for business class seat. This is not okay." The video went viral within hours. The clear, damning footage of Captain Harrison's condescending and aggressive behavior, juxtaposed with Saria's calm and polite demeanor, was a PR nightmare for Orifly. The hashtag #HashFlyLikeHarrison began to trend, used to mock the airline and its disgraced pilot. News outlets picked up the story. And soon, Captain Harrison's face was plastered across every major news network. He was no longer an anonymous pilot. He was the face of corporate prejudice, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. For Captain Harrison, whose real name was David Harrison, the fallout was swift and brutal. He was suspended without pay, his pilot's license was under review by the FAA, and he was facing a barrage of death threats and online harassment. His carefully constructed life, the one he had built over 25 years of dedicated service to his career, was crumbling around him. But the true karma, the deep, insidious karma that would unravel the very fabric of his being, was not happening on a national stage. It was happening in the quiet, tree-lined streets of his suburban Connecticut neighborhood, within the four walls of his own home. His wife, Eleanor, a woman who had always prided herself on her social standing and her husband's prestigious career, was mortified. The phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters, from angry strangers, from former friends who now wanted to distance themselves from the Harrison name. Their two teenage children, a son and a daughter, were being mercilessly bullied at school, taunted with the #HashFlyLikeHarrison hashtag. "How could you, David?" Eleanor screamed at him during one of their many explosive arguments. "How could you be so stupid? You've ruined us. You've ruined everything." David had no answer. He tried to explain, to defend himself. He claimed the girl had been rude, that he had been under stress, that the video didn't show the whole story. But his excuses sounded hollow even to his own ears. The truth was, he didn't fully understand why he had done it. It was a knee-jerk reaction, a subconscious prejudice that had risen to the surface, fueled by a sense of entitlement and a deep-seated resentment he hadn't even known he possessed. The financial strain of his suspension began to take its toll. The mortgage on their sprawling home, the tuition for their children's private schools, the payments on their luxury cars. It was all dependent on his six-figure salary. Now, that was gone. They were forced to dip into their savings, to cut back on their extravagant lifestyle. The country club membership was the first to go, followed by the weekly housekeeping service and the expensive summer camps for the kids. The once perfect facade of their life was cracking, revealing the ugly truths that lay beneath. David and Eleanor's marriage, which had long been more of a business partnership than a love affair, began to buckle under the pressure. The arguments became more frequent, more vicious. The silence between them grew heavy with unspoken resentments. One evening, about a month after the incident, David came home to find a suitcase packed in the hallway. Eleanor was standing in the doorway, her face set in a cold, hard mask. "I'm leaving, David," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I'm taking the children and I'm going to my sister's. I can't do this anymore. I can't be married to a man who is a national disgrace." David begged, he pleaded, he promised to change. But it was too late, the damage was done. The ripple effect of his actions had finally reached the shore of his own life, and the tsunami it created had washed away everything he held dear. He was left alone in the large, empty house, the silence broken only by the incessant ringing of a phone he no longer had the courage to answer. He was a pariah, a man without a job, without a family, without a future. He had lost everything. But the story didn't end there. Karma, it turned out, had a long and twisted memory, and it wasn't finished with David Harrison yet. Meanwhile, in Paris, Saria was trying to forget. She had spent a week wandering the cobblestone streets, losing herself in the art and history of the city. She visited the Louvre, the Musée d'Orsay, the Rodin Museum. She ate croissants in sidewalk cafes and read her book by the Seine. She tried to enjoy her trip, to reclaim the sense of excitement and independence she had felt before the incident. But a shadow lingered over her, a sense of guilt she couldn't quite shake. She knew that her father's intervention had been necessary, that she had been a victim of injustice. But the sheer scale of the consequences, the complete and utter destruction of a man's life, weighed heavily on her. She had not asked for a man to be fired, for his family to be torn apart. She had simply wanted to be treated with the same respect as any other passenger. One afternoon, sitting in the Tuileries garden, she saw a news report on her phone. It was about David Harrison. The article detailed his suspension, his family's struggles, the public backlash. It included a picture of him, taken by a paparazzi photographer as he was leaving his house. He looked haggard, defeated, a ghost of the arrogant man who had confronted her on the plane. Saria felt a pang of something that felt dangerously close to pity. She closed her phone, a sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. The line between justice and revenge had become blurred, and she was no longer sure on which side she stood. Her Parisian dream had been tainted, the vibrant colors of the city muted by the gray reality of what had happened. She was ready to go home. But she knew that returning to her life in New York would not be an escape. The story had taken on a life of its own, and she was at the center of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The final act of this real-life drama was yet to be played out, and the hardest karma was still waiting in the wings. 6 months after the incident on Orifly Flight 714, David Harrison was a man adrift. The FAA had, after a lengthy investigation, officially revoked his pilot's license for a minimum of 5 years. The decision was a death sentence to his career. At 52, the chances of him ever flying commercially again were slim to none. The spacious Connecticut home had been sold, the proceeds divided in a bitter divorce settlement. Eleanor had moved with the children to another state, severing all ties with him. He now lived in a small, dingy apartment in a nondescript suburb, the silence of his solitary existence a constant, crushing weight. He had tried to find other work, but his name was now infamous. The viral video was a digital stain that followed him everywhere. No one wanted to hire the racist pilot from the news. He was forced to take a series of menial, low-paying jobs: a night watchman at a warehouse, a delivery driver for a fast food restaurant. Each new uniform was a fresh humiliation, a stark reminder of the life he had lost. The anger and resentment that had initially consumed him slowly gave way to a deep, gnawing despair. He spent his nights nursing cheap whiskey, the amber liquid offering a temporary, hazy escape from the wreckage of his life. He replayed the scene on the plane over and over in his mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. He still couldn't fully comprehend the self-destructive impulse that had seized him that day. It was a toxic cocktail of arrogance, stress, and a subconscious prejudice he had never acknowledged, let alone confronted. He had seen a young black woman in a space he associated with wealth and privilege, and his mind had short-circuited, defaulting to a set of ugly, ingrained stereotypes. He had acted not as a professional, but as a bully, and the consequences had been devastating. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as he was stocking shelves in a cavernous, soulless big-box store, a voice cut through the monotonous muzak. David Harrison? He turned to see a man he hadn't seen in years. It was Mark, his co-pilot from that fateful flight. Mark looked older, his face etched with a weary sadness. "Mark," David said, his voice raspy, "what are you doing here?" I heard you were having a tough time," Mark said, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and guilt. "I wanted to see how you were." They sat in the store's bleak little break room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and microwave popcorn. Mark told David that he was still flying, but the joy had gone out of it. The incident had cast a long shadow over his career, over the entire airline. "I should have done more, David," Mark said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have stood up to you. I should have de-escalated the situation. But I was intimidated. You were the captain." David just shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "It wasn't your fault, Mark. It was mine. All mine." Mark hesitated, then reached into his pocket. I came to give you this." He slid a crumpled envelope across the table. David opened it. Inside was a check for $5,000. "What's this?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "It's from some of the guys," Mark said. "A few of the pilots. We took up a collection. We know it's not much, but we wanted to help." Tears welled in David's eyes, the first he had shed since his life had fallen apart. It was a small gesture, a drop in the ocean of his financial and emotional ruin, but it was a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. It was a sign that he was not entirely alone, that he had not been completely erased. Meanwhile, Saria was navigating her own complex emotional landscape. The incident had changed her, hardened her in some ways, but it had also made her more aware, more empathetic. She had become an unwitting symbol, a reluctant activist. She was invited to speak at conferences, to participate in panel discussions on race and privilege. She used her newfound platform not to rail against David Harrison, but to talk about the larger, more insidious issue of unconscious bias. She spoke with an eloquence and maturity that belied her years, her voice a powerful and resonant call for understanding and change. Her father, Robert, watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. He had acted out of a fierce, protective love, but he worried about the burden his actions had placed on his daughter's young shoulders. He had wanted to shield her from the world's ugliness, but instead, he had thrust her into the heart of it. One evening, as they were having dinner, Saria said something that stunned him. "I want to meet him, Dad. I want to meet David Harrison." Robert stared at her, his fork hovering midway to his mouth. "Why on earth would you want to do that, Saria?" "Because..." She struggled to find the words. "Because I need to. I need to see him, to talk to him. I need to understand, and I think he needs to see me." Robert argued against it, his protective instincts kicking in. But Saria was resolute. She explained that for her the story felt incomplete. There was a missing piece, a final chapter that needed to be written. Reluctantly, Robert agreed. He had his security team track David Harrison down, a task that was depressingly easy. They found him working at the big box store, living in the rundown apartment. A meeting was arranged, not in a sterile corporate office, but in a neutral public space, a quiet corner of a city park. The day of the meeting was gray and overcast, the sky a reflection of the somber mood. Saria waited on a park bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She saw him approaching, a stooped, hesitant figure in a worn jacket. He looked smaller than she remembered, the arrogance and authority he had once projected completely gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out shame. He stopped a few feet away from her, unable to meet her gaze. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Saria looked at the man who had caused her so much pain, who had inadvertently changed the course of her life. She saw not a monster, not a villain, but a broken human being, drowning in the consequences of his own actions. And in that moment she felt the last vestiges of her anger, her resentment, her guilt, wash away. All that was left was a profound, aching sadness for the waste of it all. The final, hardest piece of karma had fallen into place. And it was not about revenge or punishment. It was about the devastating, soul-crushing weight of regret. The air in the park was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of anger and humiliation. David Harrison stood before Saria, a man stripped bare of his pride, his identity, his future. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since that fateful day on the plain. They were the same pale blue, but the arrogance had been replaced by a raw, bottomless well of shame. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he had suppressed for months. "There are no words to express how sorry I am for what I did to you. It was inexcusable. It was racist. I was a bully, and I have paid the price for it every single day since." He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to justify his actions. He simply owned them in all their ugliness. He spoke of his lost career, his broken family, the shame that was now his constant companion. He spoke of the long, dark nights of the soul, the moments when he had considered ending it all. Saria listened, her heart aching with a complex mix of emotions. She saw the profound, life-altering consequences of a single act of prejudice. She saw the destructive power of a system that had allowed a man like David to rise to a position of authority without ever challenging the biases that lay dormant within him. When he had finished, his shoulders slumped in a final devastating admission of defeat, Saria spoke. "I didn't want this to happen to you," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I didn't want your life to be destroyed. I just wanted you to see me as a person, not as a stereotype." She told him about her trip to Paris, about the shadow that had hung over it. She told him about the unwanted fame, the burden of being a symbol. She told him that she had come not for an apology, though she appreciated it, but for a sense of closure. "I forgive you, Mr. Harrison," she said, and the words, spoken with a simple, unadorned sincerity, seemed to hang in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their shared trauma. For David, her forgiveness was both a release and a fresh wave of pain. It was a grace he did not deserve, a kindness he had done nothing to earn. And in that moment, something within him shifted. The hard shell of his despair began to crack, and for the first time in a long time, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited within him. The meeting did not magically fix his life. He was still a man with a ruined career and a broken family, but it was a turning point. It was the beginning of a long, arduous journey towards redemption. He took the money his former colleagues had given him, and he enrolled in a course on diversity and inclusion. He started volunteering at a local community center, working with at-risk youth. He began to confront the ugly prejudices that he had carried within him for so long, to unlearn the toxic lessons of a lifetime. He wrote letters to his ex-wife and his children, not asking for their forgiveness, but simply explaining for the first time the depth of his regret. He didn't know if they would ever respond, but it was a step. Saria, too, found a new sense of purpose in the aftermath of their meeting. She continued her advocacy work, but with a new perspective. She spoke not of villains and victims, but of the shared humanity that connects us all. She and her father established a foundation that provided scholarships for underprivileged students and funded programs aimed at promoting cross-cultural understanding. The story of the pilot and the black teen in business class became a case study, a cautionary tale taught in business schools and airline training programs. It was a story about the devastating consequences of prejudice, but it was also a story about the power of a single voice to effect change. Years later, David Harrison, a man transformed by his downfall, became a powerful advocate for diversity and inclusion in the aviation industry. He spoke at conferences, sharing his own story as a cautionary tale, his voice now a humble and powerful plea for empathy and understanding. He never flew a plane again, but he found a new and more profound sense of purpose on the ground. Saria went on to study law, specializing in civil rights. She became a formidable and compassionate advocate for the marginalized and the voiceless, her own experience a constant reminder of the importance of her work. Their paths never crossed again, but they were forever linked by a single dramatic moment in time, a moment that had shattered one life and forever altered the course of another. It was a story of hard karma, of a painful and public reckoning, but in the end, it was also a story of unexpected grace, of the possibility of redemption, and of the enduring power of a single act of forgiveness to heal even the deepest of wounds. The real-life drama had reached its conclusion, not with a bang, but with the quiet, hopeful dawn of a new beginning. The story of Serafina Williams and Captain Harrison is a stark reminder that our actions, born from prejudice and arrogance, can have consequences that ripple out in ways we can never imagine. It's a tale of how a single voice, refusing to be silenced, can challenge a powerful system and demand accountability. But it's also a story that goes beyond simple karma and revenge. It delves into the difficult, messy, and ultimately hopeful possibility of redemption. It asks us to look beyond the headlines and the hashtags, to see the flawed human beings at the heart of the drama, and to believe in the power of forgiveness to heal and transform. If this story moved you, if it made you think, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will stay with you long after the video ends. Your support helps us to keep telling these important stories. Thank you for listening. What happens when a simple flight turns into a battle for dignity? For 24-year-old Imani Jackson, flying first class was supposed to be a moment of peace before a demanding job. But on Oceanic Airlines Flight 732, she wasn't seen as a premium passenger. She was seen as a problem. A condescending flight attendant, a dismissive pilot, and a series of escalating humiliations pushed her to the edge. They thought she was just another girl they could bully into submission. They were wrong. They had no idea the woman they were targeting held the power to dismantle their careers and expose their company's darkest secrets, all with a single, unassuming ID card. The scent of recycled air and expensive leather filled the first-class cabin of Oceanic Airlines Flight 732 from New York to San Francisco. For Imani Jackson, it was a familiar smell, a prelude to the 5 hours of forced stillness she desperately needed. At 24, she had already spent more time in the sky than most people do in a decade. Her work demanded it. The world saw a young black woman, usually in a stylish but comfortable tracksuit, her hair braided back, a pair of oversized headphones her constant companion. What they didn't see was the razor-sharp intellect behind her calm eyes, or the weight of the responsibilities she carried in her mind and, more tangibly, in the heavy-duty Pelican case that served as her carry-on. Imani settled into seat 2A, a window seat. She exhaled, letting the tension of a frantic week in the city begin to seep from her shoulders. It was a rare indulgence, this first-class ticket. Her employer's travel policy was strictly economy, but a windfall of expiring air miles had allowed for an upgrade, a small gift to herself before the grueling work that awaited her on the West Coast. She was looking forward to the quiet, the complimentary champagne, and the simple luxury of not having her knees pressed against the seat in front of her. The boarding process was a chaotic symphony of rolling bags, muffled announcements, and anxious travelers. Imani remained in her bubble, scrolling through architectural designs on her tablet, a personal passion that offered an escape from the stark realities of her job. That's when she first noticed her. The senior flight attendant had a presence that seemed to suck the warmth from the cabin. She was a woman in her late 50s with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair that didn't move, and a smile that was more of a baring of teeth. Her name tag, pinned pristinely on her navy blue uniform, read Brenda. Brenda moved through the first-class aisle with an air of ownership, her eyes scanning each passenger, making swift, silent judgments. Her gaze snagged on Imani. It wasn't a glance, it was an assessment. A long, lingering look that traveled from Imani's braids down to her designer sneakers. Imani had felt that look before. It was the look that questioned her presence in spaces like this. She met Brenda's eyes for a brief moment, offering a polite, almost imperceptible nod. Brenda's smile tightened, and she looked away without acknowledgement. The first hint of trouble came a few minutes later. A younger male flight attendant with a nervous energy and a name tag that read Scott approached Imani. "Ma'am," he began, avoiding eye contact. "I'm going to need to check that bag." He gestured towards her Pelican case, which was stowed neatly under the seat in front of her. It was a specialized, high-impact case, designed to protect sensitive equipment, and it fit perfectly within the airline's specified dimensions for a personal item. "It fits just fine, thank you," Imani replied, her voice even and calm. "It's within the size limits." "Well, Brenda, Mrs. Adler, our lead flight purser, she feels it might be a hazard for takeoff. She'd prefer if we stowed it in the overhead bin." Imani glanced at the nearly empty overhead bins. There was plenty of space, but that wasn't the issue. "I need to keep this with me," she said, still polite but with a new firmness in her tone. "The contents are fragile." Scott fidgeted. "I understand, but—" Brenda materialized at his side, her smile gone, replaced by a mask of stern authority. "There's no but, Scott. Ma'am, the bag needs to go up. It's a safety issue." Her voice was loud enough for the surrounding passengers to turn their heads. A man in a crisp business suit in seat 3C, who had just finished reading a hardback copy of Walter Isaacson's latest biography, looked over with mild curiosity. "With all due respect," Imani said, keeping her voice low, "I've flown with this exact case as my personal item on dozens of flights, including with this airline. It is compliant and it is not a hazard." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my authority as the lead flight purser on this aircraft? I'm responsible for the safety of everyone on board. Your bag is a tripping hazard where it is." It was a lie, and a blatant one. The case was tucked so far under the seat that a person would have to be crawling on the floor to trip on it. This wasn't about safety. Imani knew with a sinking feeling what this was about. It was about control. It was about her not fitting Brenda's profile of a first-class passenger. "I'm not questioning your authority," Imani said, her patience wearing thin. "I am stating a fact. The bag is compliant. More importantly, the contents are sensitive and cannot be placed in the overhead bin, nor can they leave my sight. It's a condition of my carriage." Brenda let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A condition of your carriage? Honey, the only conditions of carriage are the ones set by Oceanic Airlines, and I am the enforcer of those conditions on this plane. Now, are you going to move the bag or are we going to have a problem?" The word honey dripped with condescension. The threat was unveiled. Imani felt a flush of anger, hot and sharp, but she suppressed it. Losing her temper was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was exactly what Brenda wanted, a reaction that would justify her prejudice. "There doesn't need to be a problem," Imani said, her voice dropping to an almost icy calm. "I am not moving the bag. It stays with me. If you have concerns about its compliance, I suggest you get the ground crew supervisor and a measuring tape. Otherwise, I would like to be left alone so I can enjoy my flight." The defiance stunned Brenda into a moment of silence. The other passengers were now openly staring. The businessman in 3C had put his book down entirely. Brenda's face, a canvas of carefully applied foundation, turned a blotchy red. She looked at Scott, who seemed to wish the floor would swallow him whole. "Fine," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "Fine. You want to be difficult? You have no idea how difficult I can be." She turned on her heel and marched towards the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain into the galley. Scott gave Imani a fleeting, apologetic look before scurrying after his superior. Imani took a deep, steadying breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The small bubble of peace she had built around herself had been shattered. She looked out the window at the bustling tarmac of JFK, but the view brought her no comfort. This was far from over. She knew Brenda's type. This wasn't a resolved issue. It was merely the opening salvo in a war Imani never asked to fight. She gripped the handle of the Pelican case under her seat. The contents inside were more than just fragile. They were a testament to her entire life's work, a symbol of the very justice and fairness that was being denied to her in that moment. And she would protect it, and her dignity, no matter what came next. The 30 minutes leading up to takeoff were a masterclass in passive aggression. Brenda pointedly ignored Imani, refusing to make eye contact as she served pre-departure beverages to every other passenger in the first-class cabin. When the businessman in 3C asked for a glass of water for Imani, Brenda replied in a saccharine-sweet voice, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, "Of course, as soon as I'm sure all cabin baggage is safely stowed for departure." She never brought the water. Imani didn't ask again. She simply sat, a statue of composure, her tablet forgotten on her lap. She was no longer trying to relax. She was observing, documenting. Every slight, every loaded comment, every pointedly ignored request was filed away in her methodical mind. This was a different kind of work now. Scott, the junior attendant, was visibly distressed. He would dart past her seat, his face a mixture of fear and guilt. He knew this was wrong, but he was a fawn caught in the headlights of Brenda's unyielding authority. The cabin door was finally sealed, and the safety demonstration began. As the automated voice droned on about life vests and oxygen masks, Brenda strode to the front of the cabin. She paused, her eyes locking onto Imani. Then she picked up the intercom phone. "Ladies and gentlemen, a final reminder from your flight crew." Her voice boomed through the cabin, dripping with false concern. "Federal aviation regulations are very clear about carry-on baggage. All items must be stowed securely in the overhead bins, or completely underneath the seat in front of you, so as not to impede any potential emergency evacuation. Compliance is mandatory. We thank you for your cooperation in ensuring a safe flight for everyone." Every word was a bullet aimed directly at seat 2A. Imani didn't flinch. She simply stared straight ahead. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engines spooled up with a deep, powerful whine. Imani closed her eyes, hoping that once they were in the air, the petty tyranny would subside. She was wrong. About an hour into the flight, somewhere over Pennsylvania, the drama escalated from a simmer to a rolling boil. Brenda emerged from the galley, but this time she wasn't alone. Flanking her was the man himself, Captain Miller. Captain Miller was the archetype of a senior pilot. He had silver hair, a square jaw, and an air of unshakable command that he wore like his tailored uniform. He looked to be in his early 60s, a man who had spent a lifetime being the ultimate authority at 30,000 feet. They stopped beside Imani's seat. The seatbelt sign was off, but their presence felt like a cage descending around her. "Ma'am," Captain Miller began, his voice a low baritone that carried no warmth. He didn't wait for a response. "Purser Adler informs me that you have been uncooperative regarding your carry-on baggage." Imani opened her eyes. She turned her head slowly to look up at him. "Purser Adler is mistaken," she said, her voice steady. "I have not been uncooperative. I have simply informed your crew that this bag must remain with me, and I have confirmed that it is fully compliant with all size regulations for a personal item." "That's not the issue." Brenda interjected, her arms crossed. The issue is your refusal to follow a direct instruction from a crew member. I am the captain of this aircraft, Miller stated, his voice hardening. My purser's instructions are my instructions. When she tells you to do something for the safety of this flight, you do it. End of story. Imani felt a fresh wave of disbelief. The pilot hadn't even attempted to assess the situation for himself. He hadn't asked to see the bag or inquired about its placement. He had simply taken Brenda's side, a united front of authority against a lone passenger. A lone black passenger. The unspoken part of the equation hung heavy in the air. Captain, Imani said, her patience stretched to its absolute limit. I understand your position, but I need you to understand mine. This case contains federally issued equipment that is sensitive and cannot be out of my possession. I'm not being difficult for the sake of it. I am following strict protocols attached to this equipment. Captain Miller's expression soured. To him, this sounded like a flimsy, made-up excuse, the ramblings of an entitled passenger. Federally issued equipment? He scoffed, a smirk playing on his lips. Right. And what would that be exactly? Your makeup case? Brenda snickered. The businessman in 3C, who had been trying to ignore the confrontation, audibly sighed and looked at the captain with disapproval. The insult, so juvenile and unprofessional, was a clear escalation. Imani's jaw tightened. The calm she had fought so hard to maintain was cracking. This was no longer just about a bag. It was about her credibility, her profession, her identity. Captain, I can assure you it's not a makeup case, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. And I would strongly advise you to reconsider your tone. Her shift in demeanor, the sudden steel in her voice, gave Miller a moment's pause. But his ego, prodded by Brenda's righteous indignation, quickly overrode it. I'm not going to reconsider anything, he snapped. Here's what's going to happen. You have two options. You can give the bag to my crew to be stowed, or we can divert this plane to the nearest airport, where you will be met by law enforcement and removed from my aircraft. We can land in Pittsburgh in 20 minutes. The choice is yours. We will not continue to San Francisco with a non-compliant hostile passenger in first class. It was the nuclear option, the ultimate threat. Diverting a plane was a costly, disruptive, and extreme measure. To threaten it over a compliant piece of luggage was an abuse of power so profound it took Imani's breath away. He was willing to inconvenience over 100 other people, burn thousands of dollars in fuel, and create a serious incident, all to win this petty battle of wills. He and Brenda stood there, a united front of smug certainty. They believed they had her cornered. They saw a young woman alone with no recourse, a troublemaker who was about to be put in her place. The other passengers stared, trapped in the unfolding drama, a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity on their faces. Imani looked from the captain's arrogant face to Brenda's triumphant sneer. She felt the weight of their combined, unearned authority pressing down on her. They had pushed and pushed, expecting her to fold. They expected tears, or yelling, or a defeated apology. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She held their gaze for a long, silent moment. The hum of the engines was the only sound. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. Okay, she said softly. You're right. A choice has to be made. She reached not for the Pelican case, but for the small leather wallet she'd tucked into the seat pocket. Her movements were calm, precise. Brenda and Captain Miller exchanged a look of victory. They thought she was getting out her ID for the authorities who would soon be arresting her. Imani's fingers found the familiar shape of the hard plastic card nestled behind her driver's license. She pulled it out. It was a simple-looking card, with a holographic seal and a formal photograph. She held it up for them to see. You've chosen to make this a federal issue, Captain, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion except for a chilling newfound authority. You have no idea how right you are. I am Investigator Imani Jackson, United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. She paused, letting the words hang in the air as their eyes struggled to read the text on the ID. Your airline is now the subject of a federal investigation for discriminatory practices, and you, Captain Miller, and you, Purser Adler, are the primary subjects. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The air in the first-class cabin crackled and went still. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint roar of the Rolls-Royce engines propelling them through the stratosphere. Captain Miller and Brenda stood frozen, their victorious expressions melting away like wax, replaced by a slow-dawning horror. Their eyes were glued to the identification card Imani held between her fingers. It wasn't the flimsy plastic of a driver's license or the colorful card of some corporate executive. This was heavy, official stock, bearing the imposing seal of the United States Department of Justice. The photograph on it matched the woman sitting before them, though her expression in the picture was sterner, more official. Beneath the photo, her name, Imani Jackson, was printed, followed by the title that had just detonated in the middle of their cabin: Investigator, Civil Rights Division. Captain Miller, a man accustomed to being in absolute control, felt the floor drop out from beneath him. His mind, usually so quick and decisive in matters of airspeed and altitude, was now a vortex of confusion and panic. Civil Rights Division. He'd heard of them in news reports, usually in the context of major lawsuits against police departments or city governments. What in God's name were they doing on his plane? Brenda's face had gone from a splotchy red to a ghastly, chalky white. The smugness that was her default setting had vanished. She stared at Imani, then at the ID, then back at Imani, her mouth slightly agape. The words, "federal investigation," echoed in her ears, a death knell for the career she had spent 35 years building. She had spent a lifetime wielding the airline's rulebook like a weapon, especially against those she felt didn't belong. It had never occurred to her that one of her targets might be armed with the full, terrifying weight of the United States Constitution. Imani slowly retracted the ID and placed it on the empty seat beside her, next to her tablet. Her demeanor had undergone a complete transformation. The weary traveler was gone. In her place sat a federal officer in the midst of her official duties. Her voice, when she spoke again, was clipped, precise, and utterly devoid of the warmth it had held before. "Captain Miller," she began, her eyes locking onto his, "you have just threatened to divert a commercial airliner to intimidate a passenger and, as it now turns out, a federal official in the performance of her duties. You did this without making any independent attempt to verify the complaint made by your subordinate. You publicly insulted me and participated in what appears to be a coordinated effort of harassment. I need you to return to the cockpit immediately. Do not speak to Purser Adler. Do not speak to any other member of the crew about this. Your only job right now is to fly this aircraft safely to its intended destination, San Francisco. Do you understand me?" It was not a question. It was an order. The chain of command on Flight 732 had just been irrevocably broken and remade. Miller, whose authority was absolute just moments before, found himself speechless. He gave a jerky, almost imperceptible nod, his mind reeling. He turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked back towards the cockpit, not daring to look back. Now, Imani's attention fell on Brenda. The flight attendant was trembling, her hands clasped in front of her as if to stop them from shaking. "Purser Adler," Imani said, her voice like ice. "My name is Investigator Jackson. I want you to go to the galley. You will take your junior colleague, Scott, with you. The two of you will remain there. The other first-class flight attendant will handle this cabin for the remainder of the flight. You will not interact with any more passengers. You will not discuss this matter with anyone. You are to write down on separate pieces of paper your full account of our interactions today, starting from the moment I boarded this plane. You will not confer with each other while doing this. I will be collecting your statements before we land. Am I clear?" Brenda could only manage a choked whisper. "Yes." "Go," Imani commanded. Like a marionette with its strings cut, Brenda turned and stumbled towards the galley, nearly tripping over her own feet. She pulled a bewildered Scott with her, disappearing behind the curtain. The soft swoosh of the curtain closing felt like a gavel falling. The cabin was silent again, but the silence was different now. It was heavy with shock and a dawning understanding. The businessman in seat 3C, the Walter Isaacson reader, was staring at Imani with a look of profound respect and awe. A woman across the aisle, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, gave Imani a small, supportive smile. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with surgical precision. Imani was no longer the victim of a petty tyrant's prejudice. She was the authority. The quiet, unassuming young woman in the tracksuit was, in fact, a guardian of the very laws her tormentors had so casually and cruelly dismissed. Imani took a slow, deep breath. There was no triumph in this, only a weary sense of duty. This wasn't a personal victory. It was the activation of a process, a mechanism she was sworn to uphold. She picked up her tablet and navigated away from the architectural designs. She opened a secure, encrypted application and created a new file. Case file, OC 732 JFK SFO Airline, Oceanic Airlines. Subjects, Captain Robert Miller, Purser Brenda Adler. Initial allegation, racial discrimination, harassment, abuse of authority under color of law, as agents of a federally regulated carrier. She began to type, her fingers flying across the screen. She documented everything. The initial look from Brenda, the confrontation over the Pelican case, the refusal of service, the loud targeted announcement, the arrival of the captain, his exact words, "Your makeup case," the threat to divert the plane. Every detail, every nuance was recorded with the dispassionate clarity of a seasoned investigator. She looked at the Pelican case at her feet. The irony was almost too rich. She was on her way to San Francisco to lead a new round of sensitive investigations into discriminatory housing practices in the Bay Area. The equipment in the case was for recording interviews and gathering evidence. She had been on her way to investigate injustice, and injustice had found her first, at 30,000 feet. Brenda and Captain Miller thought they were making a problem for a passenger who didn't know her place. They had no idea they had just made themselves the central figures in a federal civil rights investigation, one that would be conducted by the very woman they had tried so hard to humiliate. The flight to San Francisco was no longer just a journey. It was now an active crime scene, and investigator Imani Jackson was in complete control. The atmosphere for the next 3 hours of the flight was thick with unspoken tension. The third flight attendant, a young woman named Maria, handled the first-class service with a nervous but professional demeanor. She approached Imani with a mixture of trepidation and awe. "Investigator Jackson?" she asked quietly, her hands clasped behind her back. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "Water would be great, thank you, Maria," Imani replied, her tone softening slightly for the young woman who had been a bystander to the whole affair. "And please, just call me Imani." Maria nodded, relief washing over her face as she scurried away to fetch the water. She, like everyone else, was walking on eggshells. Imani continued to type on her tablet, creating a detailed timeline of events. Her training had taught her that the moments immediately following an incident were crucial. Memories were fresh, and the raw, unfiltered truth was easiest to capture. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was working. Once her own detailed notes were complete, she turned her attention to the other potential witnesses. She started with the man in seat 3C, the one with the Walter Isaacson book. He was a corporate lawyer from a major firm in Silicon Valley, and he had observed the entire exchange with a trained eye. "Excuse me, sir," Imani said, leaning slightly into the aisle. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I saw that you witnessed the interactions earlier." The man, whose name was David, nodded enthusiastically. "I saw all of it. It was disgraceful. Absolutely unprofessional. The way they treated you was appalling. I may need to take a formal statement from you when we land," Imani said calmly. "For now, would you be willing to jot down your recollection of the events? Just what you saw and heard. It would be extremely helpful." "Absolutely," David said, his brow furrowed with serious intent. He had already pulled out a leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen. "I'll start right away. I'm a stickler for details." Imani thanked him and then spoke to the woman across the aisle and two other passengers who had a clear view of the confrontation. Each of them readily agreed to provide a written account. They were no longer just passive observers. They were citizens witnessing a formal inquiry, and they seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The sense of injustice they had felt on Imani's behalf was now being channeled into a constructive official process. With the witness statements in progress, Imani knew she had to collect the accounts from Brenda and Scott. She stood up and walked to the galley, her movements measured and confident. She pulled back the curtain. The scene inside was one of quiet desperation. Scott was sitting on a jump seat, his head in his hands. Brenda was standing by the counter, her back ramrod straight, staring at a collection of liquor bottles as if trying to will them to reverse time. Two pieces of paper lay on the stainless steel counter. Imani entered the small space and the temperature seemed to drop. "Do you have your statements?" she asked, her voice leaving no room for argument. Brenda flinched and pushed her paper forward without looking at Imani. Scott did the same, his hand trembling. Imani took both documents. She glanced first at Brenda's. It was a self-serving, sanitized version of events, painting Imani as agitated and aggressive, and her own actions as standard procedure for flight safety. It was filled with lies and omissions. She then looked at Scott's. It was different. Scrawled in messy, panicked handwriting, it was a more honest, if terrified, account. It detailed Brenda's initial comments, the argument over the bag, and his own discomfort. It mentioned the captain's makeup case remark and the threat to divert the plane. It was the confession of a man trapped between his conscience and his career. Imani folded the papers and put them in a secure pocket of her jacket. "Thank you. Stay here," she commanded, before letting the curtain fall shut. She returned to her seat. She knew Brenda's statement was a fabrication, but in its own way, it was just as damning. A lie, when contrasted with the truth, was a powerful piece of evidence in itself. It demonstrated consciousness of guilt. As the plane began its initial descent towards the San Francisco Bay, Imani made a call. She used the aircraft's satellite phone, punching in a number that wasn't listed in any public directory. "Jackson," she said when the call was answered. The voice on the other end was brisk and professional. "We have your text. What's the situation?" "I need a team to meet Oceanic Airlines Flight 732 at the gate upon arrival at SFO, Imani stated. "I have initiated a formal civil rights investigation. The subjects are the captain, Robert Miller, and the lead flight purser, Brenda Adler. I will need them escorted to a secure interview room at the airport facility. I also need the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder secured as per federal protocol. There was a threat to divert the aircraft made by the captain." There was a pause on the other end, then a low whistle. "Understood. A threat to divert? That elevates things. The team will be waiting. We'll coordinate with airport operations and law enforcement. They won't be going anywhere." "Good," Imani said. "See you on the ground." She hung up the phone. The plane broke through the clouds and the sprawling lights of the Bay Area glittered below. For the other passengers, it was the end of a journey. For Imani, Brenda, and Captain Miller, it was just the beginning. When the plane finally docked at the gate and the seatbelt sign pinged off, a new announcement came over the intercom. It wasn't the captain's voice. It was the first officer. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived in San Francisco. However, we have been asked to have all passengers remain seated for a few moments. Please stay in your seats until authorized by the ground crew. Thank you." A confused murmur went through the cabin. Then the cabin door opened. But it wasn't a gate agent who appeared. It was three people in dark suits, 2 men and a woman. They were calm, professional, and their eyes scanned the cabin with an unnerving focus. One of the agents made eye contact with Imani. She gave a slight nod. He nodded back. He then stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. "Captain Robert Miller and Miss Brenda Adler, please collect your personal belongings. You'll be coming with us." The public humiliation was profound. Every passenger on that plane was now a witness. Brenda emerged from the galley, her face a mask of utter defeat. From the cockpit, Captain Miller appeared, his uniform suddenly looking like a costume, his air of command completely stripped away. He looked like a broken man. As they were escorted off the plane, their heads bowed in shame, David, the lawyer in 3C, leaned over to Imani. "That," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief, "is what I call hard karma." Imani just nodded, her expression unreadable. She gathered her things, including her precious Pelican case. The first stage of the investigation was over. Now the real fallout would begin. The sterile, windowless interview rooms at SFO became the stage for the next act of the drama. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, away from the prying eyes of passengers, the carefully constructed worlds of Captain Robert Miller and Purser Brenda Adler began to systematically unravel. Imani led the investigation on the ground, now joined by the seasoned team from the DOJ's San Francisco field office. Her tracksuit had been replaced by a sharply tailored blazer she'd packed in her suitcase, her demeanor all business. The fatigue she had felt hours ago was gone, replaced by a focused, relentless energy. Captain Miller was interviewed first, faced with two stone-faced federal investigators and the knowledge that the cockpit voice recorder, a black box that heard everything, was being secured. His story crumbled within minutes. The arrogance he had displayed on the plane had evaporated, replaced by the desperate, pleading fear of a man watching his 40-year career and his 6-figure pension go up in smoke. "It was a misunderstanding," he claimed, his voice hoarse. "Brenda, Purser Adler, she can be very persuasive. She painted a picture of an unruly, non-compliant passenger. I was just backing up my crew." "Did you, at any point, assess the situation yourself, Captain?" asked Agent Chen, one of the SF-based investigators. "Did you look at the bag? Did you measure it? Or did you simply take her word for it before threatening to divert an entire aircraft?" Miller stammered. I trusted her judgment. It was a stressful moment." "And the comment about the makeup case?" Imani interjected, her voice cutting through his excuses. "Was that also part of your professional judgment, Captain?" Miller flinched as if struck. He had no answer. He knew, and they knew, that the cockpit voice recorder would have captured his and the first officer's conversation. Any denial was futile. By the end of the 2-hour interview, he had given them everything. Brenda's history of passenger complaints, his own failure to follow protocol, and his deep-seated regret. It was the pitiful confession of a man who had allowed his ego and prejudice to override his duty. Brenda's interview was a different story. She entered the room with a defiant glare, her helmet of hair slightly askew. She clung to the fabricated story she had written on the plane, portraying herself as the victim of an aggressive passenger who had pulled a fast one, with a surprise ID. "I have been with Oceanic Airlines for 35 years, she stated, her voice quivering with indignation. "I have a perfect record. I was doing my job." Imani let her speak, letting her dig her own grave deeper and deeper. She listened patiently as Brenda contradicted herself, her timeline of events falling apart under the gentlest of questioning. Finally, Imani laid out the evidence on the table. "Brenda, here is your written statement," she began calmly. "And here is the statement from your junior colleague, Scott. They are remarkably different. And here," she continued, adding more papers to the pile, "are the signed statements from 4 other first-class passengers. All of their accounts corroborate Scott's version of events, not yours. They all mention your refusal to serve my colleague water. They all mention the captain's derogatory comment. They all describe you as the aggressor." Brenda stared at the stack of witness statements, her defiance finally cracking. "And then there's this," Imani said, delivering the final blow. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a printout of Brenda's complaint history with Oceanic Airlines' Internal Affairs Department, which the airline had been compelled to produce within hours of the investigation being launched. 17 passenger complaints filed against you in the last 5 years. 9 of them alleged discriminatory treatment based on race or perceived economic status. All 17 were dismissed by a regional manager who, records show, you have a close personal friendship with. Your perfect record, it seems, is a fiction. The color drained from Brenda's face. She looked at the paper, at the list of names and dates, a history of her own malice laid bare. The walls she had built around herself over decades of petty tyranny had crumbled to dust. She finally broke, burying her face in her hands as quiet, racking sobs filled the room. The immediate consequences were swift. Captain Miller and Brenda Adler were suspended without pay and placed on a no-fly list pending the full federal investigation. Scott, for his cooperation, was placed on administrative leave, but was offered counseling and whistleblower protection. The flight crew who had witnessed the events were all scheduled for formal depositions. But Imani's investigation was just getting started. This was no longer about one flight, one pilot, or one flight attendant. It was about a pattern. It was about a corporate culture that allowed a cancer like Brenda to fester for years, protected by a system that looked the other way. The news broke the next day. An internal memo from Oceanic Airlines was leaked to a major news organization, likely by a sympathetic employee. The story went viral. DOJ launches civil rights probe into Oceanic Airlines after first-class incident. The airline's stock plummeted. The PR department went into full-blown crisis mode, releasing a statement about taking these allegations very seriously and cooperating fully with the investigation. The public backlash was immense. Social media erupted with the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack. Former passengers and even former employees of Oceanic began sharing their own stories of discrimination, creating a firestorm of bad press. The story of the young black woman who turned the tables on her harassers with a federal ID was irresistible. A modern-day David and Goliath story. Imani's name was kept out of the press as is standard procedure for active investigators, but the details of the unnamed DOJ agent were enough to fuel the narrative. For Brenda Adler, the public fallout was a nightmare. Her name and photo were leaked online. She was vilified, turned into a national symbol of prejudice, the new airline Karen. Her quiet suburban life was destroyed. Reporters camped outside her house. Her friends stopped calling. The personal friendship with the manager who had protected her for years evaporated as he too was suspended and investigated. She was completely, utterly alone. Captain Miller retreated from the world, his reputation as a top-tier pilot in tatters. He hired a high-priced lawyer, but the evidence against him, especially from the cockpit voice recorder, was insurmountable. His union, while providing initial support, began to distance itself as the sheer unprofessionalism of his conduct came to light. Imani, meanwhile, worked tirelessly with her team in San Francisco. They subpoenaed years of records from Oceanic Airlines, hiring practices, promotion statistics, complaint resolutions, and training materials. What they began to uncover was a deep, systemic problem of bias that went far beyond one bitter flight attendant. It was a culture that implicitly favored and protected white senior employees, while complaints from minority passengers and staff were routinely ignored or dismissed. The single incident on Flight 732 had ripped the polished veneer off a major American corporation, exposing the ugliness underneath. The hard karma that David, the lawyer, had spoken of was not just a personal reckoning for two individuals. It was becoming a corporate cataclysm, and investigator Imani Jackson was at the center of the storm, calmly and methodically directing its path. Months melted into a year of legal battles, depositions, and discovery. The Department of Justice's case against Oceanic Airlines became a landmark event, a focal point for discussions on corporate responsibility and systemic bias in the travel industry. Imani Jackson, though remaining behind the scenes, was the architect of the entire operation. Her meticulous work on Flight 732 had provided the irrefutable foundation for a massive legal assault. The final reckoning came not with a dramatic courtroom verdict, but with a settlement so vast and sweeping it sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Oceanic Airlines, facing a mountain of evidence and the threat of a public trial that would further decimate its brand, conceded to one of the most comprehensive consent decrees ever imposed on a private company by the Civil Rights Division. The terms were brutal. The airline was fined an unprecedented $150 million, with a significant portion dedicated to a compensation fund for passengers and employees who could prove they were victims of discrimination. But the financial penalty was only the beginning. The hard karma was in the structural changes the DOJ mandated. Oceanic was forced to completely overhaul its entire system for handling complaints, creating a new independent oversight body with real power. They had to scrap their existing training programs and, in consultation with civil rights groups, design a new curriculum focused on implicit bias, de-escalation, and cultural competency. This new training was mandatory for every single employee, from the CEO down to the baggage handlers. Furthermore, the settlement required the airline to implement a new data tracking system to monitor passenger-crew interactions, promotion rates, and disciplinary actions, with the results being audited by a federal monitor for the next 10 years. They were being forced by law to become fair. For the individuals involved, the consequences were personal and permanent. Captain Robert Miller was stripped of his pilot's license by the FAA. His career was over. He lost his pension and a significant portion of his savings to legal fees. He sold his home and moved to a small town in Idaho, a disgraced and broken man, forever haunted by a single arrogant decision made at 30,000 feet. Brenda Adler fared even worse. Fired from the airline and facing a litany of civil suits from past victims who were now empowered by the DOJ's findings, she declared bankruptcy. The public scorn and her complete professional downfall led to a severe mental health crisis. She lost her home, her social standing, and the identity she had so fiercely and cruelly protected for decades. She became a case study, a cautionary tale whispered in airline break rooms for years to come. The manager who had covered for her was also fired and faced his own legal troubles for obstruction. Scott, the junior flight attendant, left the airline industry. The trauma of the event, coupled with his role in it, soured him on the career. However, with a letter of commendation from the Department of Justice for his cooperation, he retrained and found a new job as a victim's advocate for a nonprofit, using his experience to help others. And Imani? She became something of a legend within the Department of Justice. Her handling of the Oceanic case was taught as a model of professionalism and effectiveness. She was promoted, given more responsibility, and became a leading voice in the fight against systemic discrimination in the private sector. About 18 months after that fateful flight, Imani was at an airport again. She was flying economy this time, headed to a conference where she was the keynote speaker. As she waited at the gate reading a novel by Zadie Smith, a young black woman in an airline pilot's uniform approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me," the pilot said, a look of recognition in her eyes. You're her, aren't you? The woman from the Oceanic flight?" Imani's name had eventually become known in certain circles, though she never sought the publicity. She looked up and smiled. "My name is Imani." The pilot's face broke into a wide, brilliant grin. "My name is Captain Williams. I just wanted to say thank you. You have no idea what you did for us, for all of us. The Jackson protocols, that's what we call the new training. It's changed everything. Things are better now, safer, fairer." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "You made a difference, a real difference." Imani felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling more satisfying than any legal victory. It wasn't about the punishment or the downfall of those who had wronged her. It was about this. It was about the pilot standing before her, a symbol of a future that was a little more just than the past. She boarded her flight. As she found her seat, a flight attendant saw her and smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you anything before we take off?" "I'm fine, thank you," Imani said, settling in. She looked out the window as the plane ascended into the clouds. The skies felt different now, more welcoming. She hadn't asked for that fight, but by standing her ground, she had helped to clear the air for everyone. Her work was far from over, but in that moment, flying high above the world, Imani Jackson felt a profound sense of peace. Imani Jackson's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound battles for justice don't happen in a courtroom, but in the everyday spaces where our dignity is challenged. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane or a misplaced bag. It was about the quiet, insidious nature of prejudice and the incredible courage it takes to confront it. Her story shows that one person, armed with integrity and the conviction of their purpose, can indeed challenge a powerful system and win. The hard karma that found the crew of Flight 732 wasn't magic or revenge. It was the logical, systematic consequence of their own actions, brought to light by a woman they grossly underestimated. If this story moved you, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And for more incredible true-life dramas and stories of justice, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Thank you for watching.